Well, I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon Cathy Zabinski, a professor from the Department of Land Resources and Environmental Sciences at MSU. Cathy has recently authored a book published in 2020 titled Amber Waves, The Extraordinary Biography of Wheat from Wild Grain to World Megacrop. And I am very interested in getting and reading this book myself, having gone through the synopsis of it that's available online. So, Cathy, with that, you have the floor.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to talk. Don Mathry contacted me a few months ago and asked me, and I have to say, Don was such an important mentor to me when I first arrived on the MSU campus and so helpful with questions we had about fungi, etc., that frankly, he could ask me to do just about anything, and I would say, oh, yeah. So, anyway, but I'm very happy to talk to you today about not so much just my book, but the story of writing the book and how I came about to write a book on um, a biography of wheat, in fact. So I am, as Pat mentioned, a professor at Montana State University. I'm a plant and soil ecologist, and I grew up in the northern part of Minnesota. And so this is sort of the landscape that feels the most familiar to me from, my early origins. And I've always been interested in plants from when I was a child. And so when I went to school and decided to continue my studies in graduate school, I ended up really focused on plant ecology and very much interested in using my background in science and expertise to think about conservation oriented questions. So in the upper left corner, there's a beautiful picture of a flower of spotted knapweed, an invasive species. And my research had related to spotted knapweed had to do with how invasive plants affect, in fact, soils and soil ecology to increase their competitiveness. I also worked in restoration scenarios. On the bottom left corner is a picture of one of my former grad students, Brian Eckenrod, doing research in Mount Rainier National Park on a site that had been restored. And we're looking at how soils recover after revegetation techniques. And just next to that is a picture of some of my students north of Butte, between Butte and Helena, on a reclaimed mine site. And if you look at the color of the water in the stream running through that site, you can see that not all of our reclamation work is 100% successful. But so there's a lot of questions in that scenario related to how plant roots and soil organisms function to increase revegetation success. And along with that, I got interested in places like thermal areas in Yellowstone National Park because I thought, wow, if we can understand some of these really naturally occurring harsh environments and how plants can manage to grow in these sites with, high soil temperatures, really extreme soil pH, etc. Maybe we can use some of that knowledge to, in fact, think about how to manage human impacted sites. So as you notice, none of these pictures look anything like an agricultural field. The closest I ever got to anything like that was, thinking about growing and maximizing the growth potential of native grasses and forbs, like you see on the right. But for most of my research career, I did not necessarily think very much about agricultural systems. And when I saw a picture like this, my eyes would automatically go to the background and I would wonder about the elevation gradients and the slope and aspect and how that affected the vegetation patterns. And very little thought about the foreground and agronomy fields. And in fact, it took a sabbatical year where I was focused on, again, a non-agricultural question, but research that I was doing in France, that I started hearing more conversation from French people about regional differences in their food supply and thinking about how place affects the quality of the food, etc. It was the first time I really got interested in thinking about agriculture and the ecology of agricultural systems. And as I thought about it, I realized that my interest in thinking about disturbed sites and how we might restore those sites by, in fact, understanding what's going on in the soil, how are all these natural processes occurring, and how does that increase revegetation success. You could ask some of those very same questions in agricultural fields. If we're interested in going from kind of conventional high input agriculture into something more sustainable, part of that shift is putting more focus on natural soil processes and extracting nutrients from soil organic matter and not just fertilizers. So I started thinking about the ecology of agricultural soils and doing research in agricultural systems in Montana. So that was the first part that led me to writing this book, Amber Waves. And the second part is that if you open the covers of Amber Waves and start reading, you'll see that for the most part, when I'm successful, the book is not written as an academic tome, that I really specifically wanted to write about the science of agriculture and especially the evolutionary ecology that underlies our relationship with our crop plants. But I wanted to write about that in a way that lost the technical jargon and that told the story of how we live with these plants that we have come to depend on. And that is not, it was not a real easy transition to make from science writing to writing for the general public. It took me, I spent quite a few years thinking about how I was going to do this and practicing, going to workshops. There's a Center for Science Communication called the Alan Alda Center at Stony Brook, and I went to a week-long workshop there about how to better communicate science to a non-technical audience. So it was a really interesting process of taking myself way out of my comfort zone. So in some ways, it's a really natural thing for a professor to think about writing a book like this, because in fact, we spend our career asking questions, trying to figure out how do we answer that question, how do we get to that spot, and then going into the classroom, you've got a 10 or 15 or 50 or 150 faces in front of you who are paying to learn more information about what it is you're going to teach. How do you do a good job of that? So it's taking the same skills of asking questions, trying to figure out how to get the answers to those questions, and then translating that to somebody else who maybe doesn't have the same questions or doesn't realize they have the same questions, getting them interested in it, conveying that enthusiasm, and trying to pass on that information. So this was a journey, and it was a fascinating journey for me. So when I started thinking about, okay, I want to write a book about agriculture and food production and evolutionary ecology. Like, how do I get people interested in that? Not just people who would read a book about that anyway, but a broader public. And I started thinking about it, we all eat. We're hungry at least 3 times a day, if not more. And so it seems like a story about the the origins of some of our main food staples could be of interest. And so I was thinking along those lines, but still trying to figure out like, well, how should I frame this and what's the subject of my book? And I had a sabbatical year in 2016, 2017, that academic year that I spent in New York City and going to, in fact, there was a series of seminars at NYU put on by the School of Journalism that was specifically focused. So every 3 weeks in the evening, they would bring in a journalist and a scientist, and they would talk about how do you communicate science to the general public. And so I went to those workshops and really not only just spent the time thinking about the craft of writing science, but also having the exposure to the New York Botanic Gardens and the libraries and everything else that New York has to offer. And during that year, I put together a book proposal and with the help of an agent, found an editor at University of Chicago Press, specifically to write this book to tell the story that I framed in the context of a biography of wheat. So what I'm going to do now is just touch on a few of the highlights that came out of this because for a lot of people, wheat is not that interesting of a plant. It's one of my friends. I was explaining to him that I was writing the story about wheat, and he thought I said weed, meaning marijuana. He was just like, wow, Cathy, that's so cool. And I was like, huh, wait, did you understand what I said? I'm writing a book about wheat. And he's like, oh, wheat. Oh, okay. So how do you approach sort of the general public and say, wheat is really an interesting plant? So I started out, I decided if I wanted to think about, if I wanted people to think about our relationship with our food crops, we should start at the beginning. So the origins of agriculture. And that took me deep into the anthropology and archaeology literature. And so this is a map of an area called the Fertile Crescent, also in a region we call the Levant. And you can see there's the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea. And this green arc, in fact, is the region that's called the Fertile Crescent. And these sites on here are some of the first sites where we find evidence of cultivation of wheat, barley, lentils. And you can see that, we've got the dates on there just underneath the Black Sea. There's a dotted circle, and you've got this date 10,600 to 500 years. BP is the abbreviation for before present. So I specifically focused on a single site that's in that circle, Abu Huraira. And Abu Huraira turns out to be a fascinating site. It's right there on the Euphrates River, and it, in the early 70s, was the site of a flurry of research activity because there was a dam constructed not far from Abu Huraira that in fact flooded the area. So there was evidence based on the topography of the site that this had been an area that was a site of ancient civilization. So in 1971, just a year prior to the construction of the dam, um, there were anthropologists who went out there and archaeologists who collected a bunch of samples. They spent 2 years collecting samples in this area, took them back there primarily from Great Britain, took their samples back, and then spent the next decades analyzing those samples, looking at evidence of what plant species were growing in the area, the collecting around hearths to understand what people were cooking. They excavated the area to map out civilizations, etc. And this turned out to be potentially one of the first places that we find evidence of cultivation of crops based on both the seeds of rye and wheat that are present there, but also based on the presence of weed seeds and weeds that you primarily find in cleared fields. So this was not a site where people settled to start agriculture. In fact, it was a site where people settled because it was so ecologically rich that you could be a hunter and gatherer and live there in a single place. You had the river, so you've got a source of fish and small mammals and birds and all of the habitat, the rich habitat diversity along the river. You've got the wetlands adjacent, the floodplains adjacent to the river. You had um, cottonwood and other kinds of trees growing where there's higher moisture. And then you've got the upland grasslands, and you've got migrating ungulates coming through there. And there were plant species. People reconstructed what plants were growing around there from the evidence in these settlements, and they estimated that the early settlers of Abu Huraira probably utilized over 100 different species of plants, including some wild grown grasses that were wild wheats at the time. So this marks the beginning of increasingly intensive relationship with several of these wheat species um, that we have for a long time used for a seed source or a food source. So the first process in the change that we make to our agricultural crops is something that we call domestication, where we either inadvertently or purposely select for specific traits. So in this slide, I've got pictures of the wild relative and the domesticated crop side by side. So you can see wild tomatoes really look significantly different than what we buy in the grocery store or what we grow in our backyards. The same with corn and the teosinte wild relative. Bananas had a much different texture and structure than prior to our hybridization and domestication. Apples also very much smaller. Wheat, I don't have a picture of wheat here, but what we did with our grains was, in fact, for a plant growing in the wild, you can't really be successful unless you get your seeds into the soil to grow the next generation. So wild wheats, the seeds fall off of the plant and land on the surface of the soil. For us, as early hunter and gatherers, you can imagine if you have to like pick up single grass seeds from the soil, or you've got one plant where the seeds are still connected to the stalk, and you can grab multiple seeds from the plant, those are the ones you're going to select for easier harvesting purposes. Also, the ones with the bigger fruit, the bigger seed heads, etc. So what happened in this process of domestication with the grains was that we generally picked hardier plants with bigger seeds, where the seeds stayed attached to the plants, and then maybe we took a stick or something to beat the head of the grass, and the seeds would fall into some kind of basket. So it made for easier harvesting. So from the very beginning, we've had major impacts on our crop species. So the next major impact we have, so here's an expanded picture. You can see the Fertile Crescent is still in this navy blue arc, but in the last map I showed you, we had agriculture starting in the around Abu Huraira about 10,500 years before present. So now this is a map of 5,000 years BC. And what you can see is that, so that's about 7,000 years before current day, is that the arrows and the dots represent the sites that we moved wheat to. So its original distribution is just in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, in this, relatively narrow distribution. And now we realize it's a good food source. And as people expanded out of the Levant, probably because the climate got warmer and drier, and sites were much harder to manage from a cultivation perspective or even a gathering perspective, we moved out of those areas and we took seeds with us. And so now this plant, which grows quite comfortably in a Mediterranean climate, it germinates in the fall, it overwinters. Mediterranean winters are a little bit cool and moist and not necessarily great for growing, but just sort of hangs out. And then in the spring, when the weather warms up, it starts growing and it flowers and develops seed and finishes its growing cycle before, May or June, before the weather gets too hot. Then you've got the hot summer and the drought. These winter annuals like wheat, they're done, they're fine. They're just waiting till the spring, till the fall rains come and they germinate again. So now you take these seeds and you move them. Oh, you move them along the Mediterranean. Maybe it's not a real big climate difference, a little bit. But then people started moving up the Danube, and now we're in Northern Europe, and those winters are nothing like the winters along the Mediterranean. And so what we're doing with these crop plants is we're exposing them to incredibly unique climates relative to what they're used to. We're putting them in all different kinds of soil types. And if they don't grow, they don't grow. But if they do, they are probably the variants within the population that for some reason can switch their germination from the fall to the spring so that they don't germinate in the fall and then get hit by Northern Europe cold winters and die, but instead they germinate in the spring and then they finish their growing cycle by August. It doesn't really matter. The summers are fine for growing the whole time. Story of what we've done with just wheat, I found incredibly interesting. So besides just selecting large individuals, and besides moving plants across continents, and frankly, to all of the situation for wheat is that we've moved it to all but the polar continents. Um, we had an impact on wheat in other ways, and these are a couple of drawings from my book, and Angela Meal was my collaborator and did the illustrations for me. So on the left are two different wheat species, einkorn and emmer. And these are now classified as the ancient grains. At Abu Huraira, the people who were planting wheat were planting likely a combination of both of these species. These were the two species that grew wild. It's really, from a genetics perspective, a really interesting story. Einkorn wheat is, let's just call it the most primitive of the wheats. And so Einkorn is German for one seed. And in fact, if you count the number of chromosomes inside a cell of einkorn wheat, you'll find out that there's 14 chromosomes. So we have 46 chromosomes, 23 we got from our mother, 23 from our father. Similar story for einkorn, 7 from one parent, 7 from the other parent. But then sometime about, I don't know, 500,000 years ago, einkorn in the field, probably growing underneath an oak tree or something in a mixed stand of multiple grasses, got fertilized by another grass, which was a weedy goat grass species. And the goat grasses are not species that have ever become agricultural species. We consider it a weed. And what came of that cross was emmer wheat. And emmer wheat has, in fact, twice as many chromosomes as einkorn. So half of its chromosomes came from, it's not exactly einkorn, it was a relative of einkorn, but pretty close. And then the other half came from this goat grass. And so it's got characteristics that are distinctly different from einkorn. But the two grasses grew side by side throughout Turkey and Syria and, what we now call Turkey and Syria during ancient times. And these were the grasses that our ancestors first started cultivating. And then you get to bread wheat on the right. So bread wheat right now accounts for about 95% of the wheat that we grow across the globe. And bread wheat is the result of another weird fertilization between a different species of goat grass in a field of emmer that one of our ancestors was cultivating, probably about 8,000 years ago. So early on in the history of agriculture. So bread wheat, einkorn has 14 chromosomes, emmer has 28 chromosomes, bread wheat has 42. And, 2/3 of those chromosomes come from these goat grass species, two different goat grass species. What that last set of chromosomes did for bread wheat is it resulted in a grass that has a much softer protective cover around the seed. So we call it hull. That protective cover is the hull. And it's really hard to get rid of the hull. You have to pound it with a rock or something in a mortar and pestle. But for bread wheat, it comes off relatively easy. And the seed itself is softer. So in fact, when you grind up the seed, it doesn't take as long to grind. And so bread wheat became really kind of a favorite plant to grow in terms of processing the seeds. The only problem was emmer and einkorn are much hardier plants across different climates. Einkorn is much better in the cooler Northern Europe environments, in fact. Emmer grew very well, moving down into North Africa, throughout Egypt, etc. It could really tolerate the heat. Bread wheat is just kind of a fussy little plant compared to the other two, but it had these characteristics that made for good bread. And so, in fact, we ended up carrying bread wheat everywhere. So now I'm going to skip ahead quite a long ways in time to the next part of our story, and there's so many different pieces of the story, and there are definitely more in Amber Waves, but I'm just going to highlight a few things. So the Columbian Exchange is a term that historians use to refer to the movement of European plants and animals to North and South America, and the crop plants from North and South America, like sugar and cocoa and corn, shifting to Europe. And at the same time, we've got viruses that moved primarily from Europe to the Americas, and also animals. But we, our European ancestors moved wheat to both Mexico and Peru, like to South America, to Latin America, to North America. And eventually, wheat was grown quite extensively through North America. So, another part of the wheat story, which I had not anticipated telling when I first outlined my book and put together a book proposal, was the role that agriculture and these crop plants have in foreign relations, in war and in peace. And so what I have here are a few posters that were put together during the First World War, where part of the problem with having a war on the European continent for European food production is that a lot of the fields in Europe were not cultivated, partly because most of the people who did the cultivation were transcripted into the war effort. And secondly, a lot of the tools, whether it's horses and metal plows, whatever, were also transcripted to the war effort. So there, the continents that did not have current um, fighting stepped up and said, okay, we will either give or sell our food to you. And so Australia and Canada and the US really stepped up their wheat production. So in the US, we had a two-pronged approach. One was we're going to conserve the wheat we have here. So you've got this poster, save a loaf a week and help win the war. Food will win the war. Wheat is needed for the Allies. Waste nothing. So there were programs to say, okay, 2 days a week, you're going to go without wheat. And then we're going to send our excess wheat to Europe. Along with these wheat conservation programs, there were also programs to up the wheat production. And that's where we've got a story that comes back to Montana that is about some of the earliest industrial agriculture of wheat farms. And this is a photograph that I took a picture of this photograph, but it's a photograph of the Crow Reservation and the Campbell Farming Corporation. So Thomas Campbell was an engineer who was born in, I think it was North Dakota, could have been South Dakota, but he, during this, the late 19 teens, went to Washington, D.C. and convinced the government that he could lease land on the Indian reservations, and he was particularly interested in Fort Peck and the Crow Reservation. And then he went and talked to J.P. Morgan and some of the other bankers and said, look, we could put together, he had this vision for generating really efficient agriculture. So these tractors are amazing. This is before we've got rubber tires. So these are these steel-wheeled tractors. And if you go to the Bighorn County Museum in Hardin, you can see one of these. And this is a photograph I took of one of these tractors. And This is Thomas Campbell in the lower right, and he's standing at the front of the tractor. And so you can see the front tires are about waist level. These back tires are at least 8 feet. And they used this machinery, which had not really been applied to agricultural fields at this point, to plow up the prairie and to plant more wheat. And land was leased from the Indian reservations and, contributed to the early development of mechanized farming. And that was right here in Montana. The Bighorn County Museum has just fascinating relics of some of the buildings from the Campbell Farming Corporation, and then like this and other tractors from that era. Um, it's amazing. So, besides just production of food relative to the war efforts, and we had the same kind of scenario for World War II, and we plowed up all kinds of land in ways that was not ecologically sustainable, and then we had a dry period in the 30s and dust storms, and all of this feeds into this story of wheat and how we're trying to produce more wheat and how we do it sometimes with just really problematic consequences. The other side of this story is about using wheat as a way to avoid war. And that is, we get into the story of the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is a really um, polarizing story. There are people who see the Green Revolution as the destruction of sustainable agriculture, and there are other people who see the Green Revolution as really a massive effort to reduce hunger and to help countries be independent in their food production. And both sides of their story are have some merit. It's not just a single story, but here is a picture of Norm Borlaug, and he, starting in the 1940s, worked on breeding wheat initially in Mexico. The first goal was to get a wheat that was resistant to this fungal stem rust that was just really reducing wheat yields in Mexico. And so he brought seeds to Mexico from North America that were known to be resistant to to different kinds of rust, and bred a version that in fact could withstand some of the fungal pathogens in Mexico. The second thing he did is besides that, he introduced dwarf genes into the wheat crops. So, in fact, there were some dwarf varieties of wheat in Japan. This is a whole nother interesting story because they were growing wheat and rice in the same field. And it was better for them if their wheat didn't grow too tall and overshadow the rice as it was just getting established. They were intercropping. But anyway, we won't go there. But so they've got a dwarf wheat. Norm Borlaug's idea was if we could cross the dwarf wheat with our regular crop plants, we could grow a shorter variety of wheat that when it was irrigated and fertilized, it could manage better than our traditional crop plants that when they got water and nitrogen grew tall, tipped over, and then they were unharvestable because you couldn't take a combine out if all the stems were bent to the ground. So with the dwarf variety, the plant not just grew a shorter stem, but in fact put more resources into the seeds than into the stem. And so wheat production per plant went way up. I'm just going to draw the loop on this whole story by bringing this back to current day. This is just the title from an article that was published in Science in 2018. And this is marks the efforts by a group called the International Wheat Genome Sequencing Consortium. And it's a group that includes, this paper has, 200 co-authors from 70 different labs, a really major effort to sequence the entire wheat genome. And remember, I told you bread wheat has 42 chromosomes. It's got, instead of one copy from one parent and one copy from another parent, it's got 6 copies. And so, in fact, the sequencing of the genome, each of these, 70 different labs was responsible for, we label those 3 different parents, A, B, and D. And so, okay, I'm going to take chromosome 7B, I'm going to take the upper arms of that, and we'll work on this, etc. So anyway, it was a major effort over multiple years. It's definitely not done. And what's interesting about the genome sequencing is that of all this DNA, and wheat has 5 times more DNA than we do. I mean, just a single wheat plant versus a single human. All that DNA, like us, maybe 1% or less than 1% or maybe 1.5% is actually consists of genes that code for proteins that sort of fit our classical description of DNA and RNA and protein and organism. So we are so at the start of really understanding the detailed genetics of our crop plants. But um, with this book, what I was really trying to do was draw a link from maybe our earliest efforts to really control our food source and to improve our food source, thinking about food security 10,000 years ago, to current days where we're very much aware of the global politics associated with food production, with nutrition, and also challenged with, okay, in maybe 50 years, our population of humans is going to double from what it is now. How are we going to produce enough food? So that is, I did not address that in the book, except to say, wow, if we're ever going to be able to answer that question, what we need is to approach that question with really a broad sense of where we've come from in terms of our relationship with food, and to put our current understanding of how we do agriculture into this larger context of history and politics and ecology. And with that, I think I've probably said enough for now.